I'm really delighted to be part of this summit. This is my first summit, and I'm really, really impressed. I'm going to share my screen and share a presentation today that is going to be hopefully a conversation with you all. So between Ingrid and me, we came up with the title, Why Us, Why Now? Anti-Racism for the Long Haul. And so as I was thinking about that last night, I was like, what do you mean, why us, why now? Because that could be taken two different ways. It could be like, oh, why us? Why now? You know, in a very kind of self-pitying way. That is not the way we're going to be dealing with this right now. It's going to be like, why us? Why now? Because we have the power. We have the insight. We have the power. And why now? Because racism and dealing with racism in this nation has always been an urgent agenda, but not all of us have recognized it. But now we're at the crux of possibly being able to move this nation in a good new direction to start dismantling this system. So we have 4 tasks in front of us with regard to racism in this country. We need to be able to just communicate to everybody that racism exists, because there's still a lot of people in this country who are confused on that matter. That racism is a system, that racism saps the strength of the whole society, and that we can act. We can act to dismantle racism. So if you don't take anything else from what we're doing today, these are the 4 messages that I hope that we'll all understand at the end, and that we can all confidently communicate to everybody in our networks and those people across town and everywhere else. And we're going to divide my remarks into 2 sections. So I'm going to talk to you and give you some tools about naming racism. Then we'll take a pause for questions, and then we'll get to the second the second part of the thing, which is going to be how do we move to action. So here's the first story, the first communication tool. This is one of my allegories on race and racism that has been sparked by something that I saw in my own real life. This is a story I tell when I only have 4 minutes to let people understand that yes, racism exists, even if their whole life experience has been screaming, no, this is the land of equal opportunity. So let me tell you what happened to me. As a first-year medical student, I was, of course, very diligent, very studious. So, one Saturday I wake up and what do? I hit those books and I hit them hard and I'm like nose down studying. Afternoon comes, some friends come over, and do they distract me? No, we all get to studying long and hard, and now it's getting late and we're all getting hungry, and I have no food in the apartment, which was quite typical of me. So my friends understood and they said, never mind, Camara. Let's go into town and find something to eat. So we do. We walk into town and we find a restaurant and we walk in and we sit down and the menus were presented and we order our food and the food was served and here we are eating. So you're like, oh, Dr. Jones, that's not a very illuminating story about racism. Well, not yet. But as I sat there with my friends, I looked across the room and I noticed a sign that was a startling revelation to me about racism. So now you're intrigued and you're like, Dr. Jones, what did the sign say? Well, what did the sign say? The sign said open. So now maybe I've lost some of you. So let me recap. Here we are sitting in a restaurant eating our food. I look across the room. I see a sign that says open. Thinking no more about it, I would have assumed that other hungry people could walk in, sit down, order their food and eat. But because I knew something about the two-sided nature of those signs, I realized that now actually the restaurant was closed due to the hour, but firmly closed, and that other hungry people just a few feet away from me, but on the other side of that sign, would not be able to come in, sit down, order their food and eat. And that's when I understood that racism is structuring open, closed signs in our society. That racism structures, if you will, a dual reality. And for those who are sitting inside the restaurant at the table of opportunity eating, and they look up and they see a sign that says open, they don't even recognize that there's a two-sided sign going on because it's difficult for any of us to recognize a system of inequity that privileges us. So, for example, it's difficult for men to recognize male privilege, and sexism. It is difficult for white Americans to recognize white privilege and racism. In fact, it's difficult for all Americans to recognize our American privilege in the global context. But those on the outside are very well aware that there's a two-sided sign going on because it proclaims closed to them, but they can look through the window and see people inside eating. So back inside the restaurant, to those who ask, is there really a two-sided sign? Does racism really exist? I say, I know it's hard for you to know when you only see open. In fact, that's part of your privilege, not to have to know. But once you do know, you can choose to act. So it's not a scary thing to name racism. It's actually an empowering thing to name racism. It doesn't even compel you to act, but it does equip you to act so that if you care about those on the other side of the sign, which is an if, but if you do, why, you could even talk to the restaurant owner who is, after all, inside with you. And you could say, restaurant owner, there are hungry people outside. Why don't you open the door? Let them come in. You'll make more money, and oh, the conversations we could have. Or maybe what you'll do inside that restaurant, maybe you'll try to pass some food through the window, or maybe you'll try to tear down that sign or break through the door, but at least what you won't be doing is sitting back saying, wonder why those people don't just come on in and sit down and eat. Because you'll understand something about the two-sided nature of that sign. So when I have just 4 minutes or so, this is the story I say to say that racism is that it exists, that it's structuring two-sided or multi-sided signs in our society, that it's creating a dual or multifaceted reality. And of course, racism is not just the sign, it's the door, it's the lock, it's all of that. I have actually started a 3-hour conversation once in Flint, Michigan, when I just told that story like I just did right now, and then I followed it with this question: how could people who are born inside the restaurant know something about the two-sided nature of that sign? And it was a 3-hour conversation because there were many, 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 many ways to know. And so maybe if you want to talk to me, I encourage you right now to put your questions or comments or additions to the story or whatever in the chat, because we're going to have in a moment, in 10 moments, a chance for Q&A. So if you're thinking of something right now, put that in the chat. But what I do want to say is I am a bit encouraged that more people who are born inside the restaurant seem to be getting an understanding that this is a two-sided sign going on. I think for many people it took the videotaped lynching, public lynching of Mr. George Floyd with a police officer's knee to kind of really wake people up, although we've had cell phone videos for more than 20 years documenting these things. And then why do we need videos anyway? Why can't people just believe our experience when we report it, right? But there are more and more people, and then with, of course, the disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on communities of color. Now, of course, we've had disproportionate impact of HIV/AIDS and disproportionate infant mortality and disproportionate maternal mortality and disproportionate lots of things by race, right? But that more people who are born inside the restaurant are getting a sense that there's a two-sided sign. More of them, instead of saying, what are those people saying outside? Black lives matter. Don't they know all lives matter? More people are affirming that Black lives matter. More people are putting together the words structural racism or systemic racism. This is heartening, I would say. But I have to warn all of us that staunch racism denial, which is the kind of status quo position of many, many, many people in this country, is so seductive, that racism denial in this country is so seductive that if people just say a thing, in 6 months, they may forget why they said that thing and fall back into what I describe as the sleepiness or the somnolence of racism denial. So I encourage all of these people who are newly aware, who are inside the restaurant, right, to go beyond just saying a thing to acting. Start tearing down that sign, dismantling the lock, take the door off the hinges, because if we act, then we will not forget why we acted. I want to move from that. So first of all, I hope that everybody listening, that you will remember enough about this story to share it with somebody in your household or share it with somebody in your social network, online or whatever, as a way of helping people understand that racism exists, yes, and that it's structured in open close sign. And I have to say, it's not just racism that's structured at open close sign. It's, sexism, it's, homophobia, it's capitalism. There's lots of different open close signs going on in our society. More on that in a minute. I want to shift from that story to providing my definition of racism. So when I say the word racism, I am clear that I'm talking about a system. So I am not talking about an individual character flaw or a personal moral failing or even a psychiatric illness, as some people have suggested, but I'm talking about, although racism can show up in those ways, right? But in its essence, racism is a system of power. And a system of doing what? It's a system of doing two things, of structuring opportunity and of assigning value. And on what basis is the opportunity structured? And on what basis is the value assigned? It's based on so-called race, which is the social interpretation of how one looks in our race-conscious society. So as Dr. Gandhi kept being very clear when she kept showing these, statistics showing differences by race, she kept saying, race is not biology. We have mapped the human genome. There is no basis in the human genome for racial subspeciation. Race is not even culture, because in any of these broad racial groups, you could have people with many different histories, many different ethnicities, many different languages, many different health practices and beliefs, and all in all. Race is not social class, although in this country, because of structural racism, race and social class are related to each other in this country, but that doesn't just so happen, and I'm going to talk to you about that again. But this thing we call race that might get checked off by somebody, if you go into a clinic, or if I were admitted, say, unable to report my self-identified race in an emergency department, and that would be checked off by a medical admitting clerk, and that would become part of a health statistic, that's the same race that a police officer notices, or a taxi driver, or a teacher in a classroom, or a judge in a courtroom. And it is that socially assigned race that has profound impacts on our health and well-being in this nation, on our opportunities and resources and our risks and exposures and the like. So this thing that we call race is the substrate on which racism has operated across the centuries, and which it continues, the basis on which it continues to operate day to day. So if race is the social interpretation of how one looks, racism is that system operating on this so-called race that structures opportunity and assigns value and has impacts. Now, when we do think or talk about racism at all in this country, which is not enough, more, I would say, in the past several months, but when we do, we recognize that racism unfairly disadvantages some individuals and communities. But it shouldn't take us long to recognize that every unfair disadvantage has its reciprocal unfair advantage, so that racism is also unfairly advantaging other individuals and communities. And that's the whole issue of unearned white privilege that we hardly ever talk about in this country, because it makes some people, especially some white people, uncomfortable. And I've been talking about this for decades, and I used to almost apologize at about this point in my talk. I would say, well, I can look out. I see some of you maybe a little squirmed a little bit. I said, well, shake it off. Shake it off. Stay with me. I'm going to tell you more stories. I do not apologize like that anymore. No, what I say is, if you feel uncomfortable, I encourage you to lean into that discomfort, because I have come to recognize that for all of us, the edge of our comfort is actually our growing edge. But there's a third impact of racism that many of us miss, and that is that racism is sapping the strength of the whole society through the waste of human resources. So, for example, it's not just that Black Lives Matter. Black lives are precious. Black lives are genius. Black lives are leadership. Black lives are creativity and generosity and love and all of these things. And when we constrain Black lives and Latinx lives and Indigenous lives and Asian lives and Native Hawaiian, other Pacific Islander lives, and all of these racialized lives, when we constrain these lives slowly by not vigorously investing in the full excellent public education of all of our children, because Some decision makers, the blinders of racism that they wear makes them believe there is no genius in the barrios or the ghettos or on the reservations. They believe we can get along very well, thank you, without those kids, when of course there's genius in all of our communities. And if we were to only vigorously invest in that genius, we could be doing so much better as a nation or even as a world. Or when we constrain those Black and Indigenous and other people of color lives slowly by being complacent with the wholesale warehousing disproportionately of so many Black and brown men in our prison system, as if that didn't separate us from human potential, or whether we in this society snuff those lives out in an instant in a barrage of police bullets or a police officer's knee. That is not just a problem for the genius and creativity and love and humanity that's been lost by the individual or the family that has been irreparably harmed forever. It represents a loss to the whole society, because racism in these slow or quick constraints of our lives saps the strength of the whole society through the waste of human resources. I just need to say one more thing before I get off of this slide, which is going back to, people who are like, oh, don't talk about how racism unfairly advantages other individuals and communities. Don't talk to me about unearned white privilege. I have come to know that there are many people in this country who honestly believe that there are two states of being, disadvantaged and normal. And the reason that those people think that there are two states of being disadvantaged and normal is that we as a nation are ahistorical, and people do not understand that their so-called normal is built up on a whole mountain of unfair advantage. But now I'd like to shift gears from what I call my global definition of racism, really understanding. So already, the three things that I gave you four key messages that I was going to cover at the beginning. I've already hit three of them, right? The one that racism exists. I've given you a story to help people understand. People can understand an open, closed sign. And they can understand that if you're inside, you're born inside and you've always seen open, that you might not understand about that. But once you understand that that is a two-sided sign, then there's no excuse for you to just sit back now and wonder why don't those people come in. So that racism exists, that allegory. This definition I just gave you also presents racism as a system, and it talks about how it saps the strength of the whole society. I actually have a very, very, very new allegory that I thought I was going to have all illustrated by today. I got it partially illustrated. At the end, if anybody wants me to tell that story as a question, I'd be happy to tell that story, which is a new allegory demonstrating that racism is a system. But now I want to shift to the question, how could racism turn into differences in health outcomes? How can it turn into the differences in terms of who is infected with HIV? Right, in this nation. How can it turn into differences in the impact of COVID-19 on communities of color? How can it turn into differences in asthma prevalence? How can it turn into differences in terms of obesity prevalence or diabetes or heart disease or kidney disease, these things that are now the pre-existing conditions that are making people, once they're infected with the SARS-CoV-2 virus, now it makes them more likely to die from the COVID-19 disease? How is racism turning into differences in numbers of our babies dying before their first birthday, or numbers of our women dying in childbirth or pregnancy-related deaths? And so to understand that, 25, 30 years ago, what I'm going to present you now, I've been telling this framework and this story for many, many years. You'll see at the bottom, the reference, this paper was actually published in 2000, so 20 years ago. 3 levels of racism: institutionalized or structural. Now, when we say structural, we're talking about what I used to call institutionalized. Personally mediated, which some people describe as interpersonal. But I am so clear that racism is a system. This is personally mediated because it's the system mediated through people, and internalized. So let me quickly define each of these levels, give you examples of how they can impact health, right? And then illustrate them with another one of my allegories, my gardener's tale. Institutionalized or structural racism is the system, if you will. It's the constellation of structures, policies, practices, norms, and values which, taken together, result in differential access to the goods, services, and opportunities of society by race. This is the kind of racism that does not require an identifiable perpetrator because it's been institutionalized in our laws and customs and background norms. This is the kind of racism that shows up as inherited disadvantage, or its reciprocal inherited advantage. We see it in terms of material conditions as well as in terms of access to power. So differential access to quality housing by race, or excellent educational opportunities by race, or equal employment opportunities, or even the same level of income at the same level of employment. And clearly these things have impacts on health. Differential access to medical facilities, which could be physical access, it could be financial access, it could be linguistic access. Differential access to a clean environment, and the very well documented disproportionate placement of toxic dump sites and bus transfer stations and the like in communities of color. And with regard to power, differential access to power as information, which could be health information or even information about our own histories. Differential access to power as resources, not just capital resources, but social networking resources and knowing somebody on the board. And differential access to power as voice in media, in government, and the like. Now, in the past, I have been interrupted right about now, and somebody has said, well, excuse me, Dr. Jones, but when you look at housing, education, employment, income, Dr. Jones, isn't that what we call social class? Why do you have that on a slide about racism? Are you talking about racism, or are you really talking about social class? Now, that's a very important question. So I'm going to address it. And the first part of my answer is that it does not just so happen that people of color in this country are overrepresented in poverty, while white people in this country are overrepresented in wealth. That is not just a happenstance. And for each marginalized or stigmatized or oppressed group of color, there's been some initial historical injustice. So, for example, there's somebody doing something with my slides, but that's all good. For example, for American Indians, the initial historical injustice was the taking of the land and the near genocide and moving the survivors to reserve lands. And then in some instances, something good was found under one reservation. Oops, you got to pick the people up and move them somewhere else, right? Or, there were people who families lived for centuries in Mexico, never crossed the border, but the border crossed them, and now their great-grandchildren are being still harassed and targeted and killed. We have Chinese laborers brought to this country to build our railroads, unable by law to marry and unable by law to bring their families. We have, Japanese Americans who were interned during World War II when the German Americans or the Italian Americans were not so interned. For people of African descent, the initial historical injustice was the kidnapping of West African people and our importation across the Atlantic with tremendous loss of life in the Middle Passage. And then for the survivors and their progeny for generations, what I describe as the coerced usury of our unpaid labor for centuries to build this country. But then some people hear me talking like that and they're like, oh, Dr. Jones, there you go talking about slavery. Dr. Jones, we all recognize that slavery was an unfortunate chapter in our nation's history. But Dr. Jones, the enslaved people were emancipated by 1865, and we are now in 2020, which makes that 155 years ago. So all else being equal, Dr. Jones, don't you think the impacts of slavery would have washed out by now? But of course, the answer to the question is in the question, all else being equal, and all else has not been equal since 1865, and all else still is not equal today, and there are what I describe as present-day contemporary structural factors that are perpetuating that initial historical injustice and all of the others that I have described and the ones that I haven't described. And these contemporary structural factors are part and parcel of institutionalized or structural racism. So when you ask me, am I talking about social class or am I talking about racism? My response is that structural or institutionalized racism explains why we even see an association between social class and race in this country. It's a very important aha. And I just want to say one more thing about that tension, between the social class. Like, are we supposed to be anti-poverty or are we supposed to be anti-racism? People sometimes frame it like that, like it's an either or. I tell you, I care deeply. Some people say, Camara, you talk so much about racism, you don't care about poor white people. I do, indeed. I care about poor white people, poor black people, poor Latinx people, poor indigenous people, poor Asian people, poor Native Hawaiian, other Pacific Islander people, poor all kind of people. I care about all of it. And we need to have very vigorous anti-poverty strategies. Indeed, we do. And when we come up with that magic wand or whatever it's going to be, if we had it today, ding, I would eliminate poverty across the land, no question about it. And if I could go ding, ding twice and eliminate not only poverty, but equalize income, I would go there. But my warning is that if we were to even equalize income by race today, if we did that without addressing the background structures, policies, practices, norms, and values, the mechanisms of institutionalized racism, even if we eliminated poverty today and equalized income, if we did it without addressing racism, then in one generation, we would start to see a stratification by race again in terms of income. This is not an either or proposition. It is a both and, both anti-poverty and anti-racism. These are our struggles. I need to just say one more thing, which is that this level of racism, structural racism, occurs through acts of doing, acts of commission, as well as acts of not doing, acts of omission, and very, very often it shows up as lack of action, inaction in the face of need. I spent most of my time there on the structural racism because that is the most important. But the second level of racism that I describe, personally mediated racism, I define as differential assumptions about the abilities, motives, and intents of others by race, and then differential actions based on those assumptions. This is what most people think of when they hear the word racism. Somebody did something to somebody. It includes the different idea, the prejudice, and the different action, the discrimination, and it has its impacts through police brutality, physician disrespect, which could be as subtle as a physician not giving a patient the full range of treatment options because the physician figures, well, that patient wouldn't understand or wouldn't comply or couldn't afford or whatever they assume. Or it could be quite blatant, like sterilization abuse, which has had many iterations in our nation's history. And if you've been listening to what's been happening out of the detention center in Georgia, it's still, very actively on today. Shopkeeper vigilance, being followed around in stores, or waiter indifference, not getting quick, respectful treatment, which are different elements of what some people call everyday racism, the microaggressions, the subtle communication of disrespect that might be related to elevated blood pressures in communities of color, blood pressures that don't even go down at night. And teacher devaluation, very important manifestation of this level of racism, because if a teacher looks at a young child and thinks, that child can't learn, and puts them off in the attention deficit disorder track, that child will never even know their full potential, much less have the opportunity to develop to their full potential. Now, personally mediated racism, like institutionalized or structural, can be through acts of doing, as well as acts of not doing, but even more important is to recognize that this level of racism can be unintentional, as well as intentional. You do not have to have intended to do something racist to have a racist impact. The third level of racism, internalized racism, I'm defining here from the point of view of members of stigmatized races as acceptance by members of stigmatized races of negative messages about our own abilities and intrinsic worth. I have friends who do anti-racism training and the like who said, well, Camara, what about the internalized sense of entitlement that many people walk around with? Isn't that also internalized racism? Yes, I agree that it is. I don't have it on this slide because I couldn't for a long time understand how could a sense of entitlement turn into bad health outcomes, although I'm getting an inkling that maybe a sense of entitlement thwarted, that is, you feel entitled but then you feel like your entitlement has been thwarted, may be related to what some people are describing as the diseases of despair in white populations, so the suicides and the opioid epidemic and the like. But the rest of the slide is still from the point of view of members of stigmatized races, where internalized racism shows up as self-devaluation, feeling maybe I'm really not as good as, maybe I shouldn't try to graduate from high school, or apply to that college, or try to get that job, or live over in that side of town. It turns into the white man's ice is colder syndrome. That phraseology comes from my parents' generation. What it meant then, and what it still means for many people of color today, is say I'm black and I need a lawyer, I might actually go seek out a white lawyer over a black lawyer. Or if I were sick, I might prefer the white doctor over the black doctor if I could find a black doctor. Or if I were black and my lemonade were warm, I might go way down the street to get the white man's ice over the black man's ice, deeply believing that the white man's ice is colder, deeply internalizing the myth of white superiority. Internalized racism shows up as resignation, helplessness, hopelessness, which turns into a lot of self-destructive health behaviors, turns into not registering to vote or not voting even if you are registered. And people, I just need to step away for a minute. We cannot let that happen now. All of us there are such efforts to disenfranchise such big chunks of our citizenry. We must, all of us, make sure we're registered to vote, that all our family members and friends and at least 10 people you don't know are registered to vote, and then vote. We have to all make a plan. But anyway, I digress. Internalized racism is acceptance by members of stigmatized races of the limitations to our own full humanity of the box into which we've been placed. So that when we hear young high school students of color, where one of the friend group is trying to be the valedictorian and the other friends are teasing her or him, saying, well, you know, so-and-so is just trying to be white, we need to challenge that. Because since when did white people claim exclusive access to excellence? They did not. So now I'm going to illustrate these 3 levels of racism with my Gardner's tail allegory. So I'm going to stop sharing so that I pop up really big on your screen right now. So I'm using my hands a lot in this story. So let me tell you, this is another of my allegories that's based on something that happened to me in my own real life. So let me tell you what I saw with my eyes, and then we're going to make it a story about racism. So my husband and I have been married about a year, and we moved down to Baltimore so that I could finish up my PhD at Hopkins, and we bought our first freestanding house, cute little house with a big wraparound porch on it with flower boxes dotted all on the porch. And we bought this house in October, which really is not the time to plant in Baltimore, so we waited. But when spring came, my husband, who loves to garden, he ran out with our marigold seeds, getting ready to decorate our cute little house. And then he ran right back in because he said, Camara, you know, some of these boxes out here have dirt in them, but some of the boxes are empty. I need to go to the gardening store. So I was like, okay. So he goes to the gardening store and he hauls back big old bags of potting soil. And then we fill up those empty boxes. And then we take equal numbers of our marigold seeds and put them in all of the boxes, and we water all of the boxes the same. And now, you know, by this time, I'm not the gardener in the family. I'm exhausted, right? I'm just going to sit back and be delighted. Well, about 3 weeks later, I'm walking out of my front door. I finally pay attention to these flower boxes on my porch, and what I saw made me literally stop in my tracks, because what I saw made me think we had planted completely different species in some boxes versus others, because some of the boxes were full of plants, and they were tall, vigorous looking plants, and some of the boxes just had a few plants in them, and they were kind of scrawny and scraggly looking. And then I realized what had happened. That potting soil that my husband had bought turned out to be rich, fertile soil, so that every single seed planted in the rich, fertile soil had sprouted. The strong seed had grown very tall and vigorous, but even the weak seed had made it halfway up. But that old soil that we had found there turned out to be poor, rocky soil. So the weak seed planted in the poor, rocky soil just died. And even the strong seed in the poor, rocky soil had to struggle to make it to a middling height. And maybe some of you guys are gardeners, so you know, you're nodding your head. Maybe you've composted half of your garden. Maybe you have seen this image with your own real eyes, and the image is, of course, about the importance of the soil, the importance of the environment. But now I'm going to take this image and I'm going to make it a story about racism by introducing a gardener. So now we have a gardener who has 2 flower boxes, one which she knows to have rich, fertile soil, one which she knows to have poor, rocky soil, and she has seed for the same kind of flowers, except some of the seed is going to produce pink blossoms, and some of the seed is going to produce red blossoms. And the gardener prefers red over pink. So what does she do? She takes the red seed, puts it in the rich, fertile soil, pink seed in the poor, rocky soil. 3 weeks later in her flower boxes, she sees what I saw in mine, that in that rich, fertile soil, all the red seed sprouts, strong red seed, tall and vigorous. Even the weak red seed makes it halfway up. In the poor, rocky soil, the weak pink seed dies. Here comes the strong pink seed struggling to make it to a middling height. And then in those 2 flower boxes, those flowers go to seed. And the next year, same thing happens. And then those flowers go to seed. And year after year after year after year, same thing happens. Till finally, about 10 years later, gardener's looking at her flower boxes and she says, you know, I was right to prefer red over pink. So we're going to interrupt the story here to say the first part of this story is how institutionalized or structural racism works, where you had the initial historical injustice of the separation of the seed into the two types of soil. You had the contemporary structural factors of the flower boxes keeping the soil separate, and then through lack of action, inaction in the face of need, perpetuation of the inequity. But let's pick the story back up and say, well, okay, where is personally mediated racism in the garden? Well, the gardener's looking at her flowers and she says, oh, those red flowers are so beautiful. And then she looks at the pink flowers and she says, oh, those pink flowers sure are scrawny and scraggly. So she plucks off the pink blossoms before they can even go to seed. Or she may notice that a pink seed has blown into the rich, fertile soil. So she plucks it out before it can establish itself, which is some of the anti-affirmative action stuff that goes on. And where would internalized racism be in the garden? Well, the red flowers are just living their lives, enjoying being red, many of them not acknowledging or maybe not even understanding that they're benefiting from enriched soil. Pink flowers are looking over at red, thinking red is mighty fine and wishing with all their hearts that they too could be red. And here come the bees, minding their own business, collecting nectar, but pollinating at the same time. So here comes a bee into one of the pink flowers and to another pink flower and to this pink flower and these flowers. Like, get away from me, bee. Don't bring me into that pink pollen. I prefer the red because the pink flower has internalized that red is better than pink. So now the question arises, what do we do to set things right in this garden? Well, we could start by addressing the internalized racism. So we can go over to the pink flowers and we can say, pink is beautiful, power to the pink. And that is a very important intervention. But if that's all we do, it's not going to change the situation in which the pink flowers find themselves. So you say, oh, okay. Well, let's address the personally mediated racism. Let's have a conversation with that gardener. Or better yet, let's have a workplace multicultural workshop for the gardener. So we have our workshop, and in the workshop we say, dear gardener, would you please stop plucking those pink flowers? And maybe she will, and maybe she won't. But even if she does, it's still not going to change the situation in which those pink flowers find themselves. If we really want to set things right in this garden, we must address the structural racism, which means we have to either break down the boxes and mix up the soil, or if you want to keep separate boxes, that's all right too, although it makes it easier for that same gardener to continue segregating resources going forward. But if you decide you're going to keep separate boxes, it means you need to enrich that poor rocky soil until it's as rich as the rich fertile soil. And when you do that, the pink flowers will flourish. They'll be looking beautiful, grand, and glorious. So that in that intervention on the structural racism, you'll have also addressed the internalized racism. Pink won't be looking over at red thinking red is better or wanting to be red. And in that intervention, you may also address the personally mediated racism. Now, the original gardener may have to go to her grave preferring red over pink, but her children, who grow up and see the flowers equally beautiful, would be less likely to have that same kind of attitude. So this story has been to illustrate these three levels of racism, to strongly suggest that if we want to set things right in the garden, we must at least address the structural racism. When we do the other, it's good to address all the levels at the same time, but at least address the structural, and when we do, the other levels may take care of themselves. But I am actually going to go back to the slides for just a minute, and then we'll open it up for your questions and answers. But there's a very important question that I haven't asked yet. So let me get here. And the very important question is, who is the gardener, right? Because the gardener is the one that I gave the power to decide, the power to act, and control of resources, which are actually the elements of self-determination. So who is the gardener? Well, government is a huge part of the gardener, but not the only part. Media, foundations, corporations, communities, to the extent they have self-determination. But whoever the gardener is, it is dangerous when the gardener is allied with one group. I painted her red. That's why she prefers red over pink. And it's dangerous when she's not concerned with equity. When she can look at her flower boxes and think that her garden is beautiful, thank you, because she's not even counting the pink flowers as part of her garden. And so our challenge now is, what do we do about the gardener? Do we make the gardener striped or polka dotted or fuchsia? Do the pink flowers have to grow or recruit their own gardener? Lots of questions can come out of this story. Before I open it up for your questions and comments, I want to share two questions that I carry with me now everywhere, and I share everywhere. The first is, when I was asked, excuse me, Dr. Jones, but why should the red flowers share their soil? When I heard that question, I loved that question because it showed me the power of this story to start conversations about racism, which might otherwise be difficult if we're talking about racism between you and me. My answer to that question, why should the red flowers share their soil, is that actually that soil doesn't belong to the red flowers. It belongs to the whole garden. But here's the second question. What if that's not the original gardener that we're looking at? What if that's the gardener's great-great-great-great-grandchild? Here we are. And the great-great-great-great-grandchild has always seen the flowers looking like that, may not even think there's a problem to be solved. So very quickly, in 3 steps, we must make the differences in the height and vigor of the problems, the height and vigor of the pink and red flowers a problem requiring urgent solution. We've got to put it on the agenda. And then when we try to figure out, now what are we going to do? The second step is to make those flower boxes transparent. We must be talking about the differences in the quality of the soil in order to be able to address the differences in the quality of the soil. And the third thing is, as we make those flower boxes transparent, we must also make sure that everybody knows that the pink seed did not just go launch themselves into that poor rocky soil. So we have to talk about history, and we have to talk about how the gardener's initial preference for red over pink set up the whole situation. Where that initial preference, some people might call it cultural racism. It's part of what I describe as structural racism. In our setting in the US, it's white supremacist ideology, how that set up the whole situation. Because if we do not address that gardener's initial preference for red over pink, which continues to be a preference for red over pink, if we don't address that, even if we were to compel that red gardener today to enrich the poor rocky soil until it was as rich as the rich fertile soil, if she continues to prefer red over pink, she will continue to privilege red over pink going forward. So we have to, when I defined racism as a system that does 2 things, it structures opportunity and assigns value. When I told this story, I used to be all about the soil in the boxes until I realized that values piece. So we must address both pieces of racism if we're going to set things right in the garden. So now we have a pause for questions. I'm going to stop sharing, and then we'll take maybe 5 questions right now. And then I just wanted to circle back and just kind of round things out and then have time for more questions at the end.
So Dr. Jones, you have not seen the chat box, but the chat box is on fire. Look, there are chants in the chat box, Dr. Jones for president.
Thank you all. And we're not done yet. I got more for us. So I got more. Is there anybody who wanted me to answer the question now, or I could jump back in and then we could,
So we have a hand raised. The person, you don't have your name, it's LG Stylo 3 has their hand raised. Oren, can you unmute LG Stylo 3 for their question?
I have asked him or her to speak.
Hello?
Hello, we can hear you.
Hi, my question to Dr. Camara. I'm a proud trans woman from New York City, and my name is Marcia Chase. And my thing is, I'm so happy for listening to your story about the seeds. And, we're always so afraid of having the dialogue about racism. Is like, how do we educate each other to mitigate the understanding that we're all individually equally made and individually equally important in this society, in this world, as we are? How do we create that conversation without the self-mitigation and the internalized? Because I have an issue with Black people that don't see voting as a valuable place of assigning their equitable space in community. How do we do that? Because as a trans woman, in every system of structural racism, I'm excluded.
Right. This is such an important question. So I'm going to answer it in 2 ways. The first is that there are 7, what I have now described as values targets for anti-racism action. But the core of it is white supremacist ideology, it's not a lightning rod term. It's a simple description of a false belief in a hierarchy of human valuation by race that puts white people at the top as the ideal and the norm, which gives people who are living as white a sense of entitlement. It results in the dehumanization of people of color and fear at the browning of America that's underlying our politics today. There are many different, like the whole idea, the myth of meritocracy. I'm going to talk about these in more detail in a minute, but the idea that if you work hard, you will make it, right? Which then, if you believe that, then it means that those people who didn't make it must be lazy or stupid, not working hard. I give you that most people who have made it have worked hard. Not everybody who's made it has worked hard. We got very prominent examples of that. But most people who made it have worked hard, but that doesn't mean that there aren't other people working just as hard or harder who will never make it because of an uneven playing field that is being structured and perpetuated by racism, sexism, heterosexism, and the like, capitalism, and all of these. And when we deny those systems that are structuring and perpetuating the uneven playing field, we're endorsing the myth of meritocracy. I'm going to just say that when we get to the point where I talk about the 7 values targets, then you'll see that these are these other things that are in the air. So we have a lot of work to do. What I'm trying to say there is there's a lot of work to do. There's a whole lot of just the way that we, the kind of cultural or societal assumptions in this society are fighting. They are promoting the belief that racism doesn't exist. And when you think racism doesn't exist, and then you look at the differential distribution of income and wealth and education and housing and disease and health and all of these things by race, then you jump to some other conclusion, right? So the thing is, we need to equip people to understand that racism exists. And so I'm going to give you some more tools for that. On the point of young people, or people feeling like, well, I did my thing because I've been mobilized. I've been out in the protests for months now. Every day I'm there, right? You can count on me. I say, this is amazing. And yes, when we add our bodies to protests and mobilizations, you're saying, look at me, count me in this number. But when you vote, you're also saying, look at me, count me in this number. And when you make sure that you're counted in the census, you're saying, look at me, count me in this number. And we have to not just stay in one channel. We have to be counted in this number in all the ways that we can count. Why us? Why now? Because we have the power. We have to use the power. We have to be the power in collective action. In as many parts of collectives as we can be. So I know I may not have even addressed every little aspect of your question, but I'm going so long that I'm going to stop and get the next question.
All right, Abigail has her hand raised.
Oh, yes. Hello. Could you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, yes. Hi. It was a great lecture. Thank you. And I just want to know, I happen to be a Jewish descent, and the Jewish, suffered from the Holocaust and whatnot. And sometimes I feel like there's a battle between, the African American and the Jewish, and even by downtown Brooklyn, by Kingston Avenue. I went to school around there, by that area, Eastern Parkway. So I just want to know.
Wait, you muted yourself again.
Oh, hold on. Oren, can we unmute Abigail again? I think.
Yeah, I think she hit the mute button by mistake.
Yeah, I heard you. Okay.
I just want to know, do you think it's getting better now with that than it was in the past?
So this is what I think. I think that there are many open closed signs operating in our society. And so one certainly has to do with Jewish versus not. And I also think that it's human nature for people to recognize the most pronounced closed sign that affects them without recognizing that they're on the open side of other signs. And we don't ever want to have an oppression Olympics where my oppression is worse than yours.
Right.
So what we have to say is there are many that these open closed signs are operating, on gender, they're operating on immigration status, language, they're operating on zip code, they're operating in lots of different ways, as well as by race, ethnicity, and religion. And so it is tempting for people to just kind of stop being anti-oppression at the level where the sign is closed to them, and recognize that in many other ways the sign is open to them. So, for example, as a middle class or upper middle class African American woman, I recognize sexism, I recognize racism, but I may not recognize my class privilege as much as I should, right? Or my language privilege as much as I should, or even my American privilege as much as I should. So all of us need to engage in all of these struggles. I usually have a slide where this is going to be my answer. The definition that I gave of racism can be generalized to be a definition of any system of structured inequity. So, for example, what is sexism? That's a system of structuring opportunity and assigning value based on gender. that unfairly disadvantages some individuals and communities, unfairly advantages other individuals and communities, and saps the strength of the whole society through the waste of human resources. And I recognize there are many axes of inequity operating in our society today. I usually have a whole list of them, so you put your religion and gender and all of that, and they are intersecting in communities and in individuals. So why do I focus on race as the axis of inequity and racism as a system? It's because racism is foundational in our nation's history, and yet so many people are in staunch denial of its continued existence and profoundly negative impacts on the health and well-being of the whole nation. So I encourage all of us to become actively anti-racist today, even as we're also engaging in these other struggles, and to the extent that we're able to dismantle the mechanisms of racism, the other struggles will benefit as well.
Yeah,
so that's my very full answer to your question.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yes.
All right. Are you ready to go back to your?
I'm ready to go back because I'm afraid of.
You're not even done yet.
No, I'm not done yet. I'm not done yet. But I will be faster.
One more question. We do have one more person with their hand up. If you want.
Okay, one more question, and then tell me, Ingrid, when am I supposed to finish by?
Mike, timekeeper, when are we supposed to be done by? I think we have them probably. We started about
1 p.m. is when the next session starts. So but I don't want to be the one to make her be quiet. I just want to know that Ingrid is going to be the one that makes her stop.
So I'll take one more question, and I'll answer very briefly. I'm sorry, but I'll try to, so that I can get to the rest of what I have. Okay.
All right, Serge, Oren, can you unmute Serge?
Hi, hello, Dr. Jones. How are you?
Hi, I'm fine.
Great. By the way, dynamic talk and discussion. I really love it. I have a question, and you don't have to be political at all. But my question, since you mentioned housing, and we all know housing is there's a big disparity. Also, there's a lot of racist, systematic racism, when it comes to housing, the way that region and localities and the ghettos and all that stuff were constructed in the country and stuff like that. And we've had President Obama, our beloved president, Black president, of the United States, who spent 8 years, in his term. And then we also have now Ben Carson, who's a doctor, medical doctor, such as yourself, who's actually the HUD housing secretary. And then now we have on the ticket with Biden, Kamala Harris. Where do you see, and we see actually the constant insult that the current administration have actually put on suburbia, those references and everything, to make it seem like Black can't, minorities, would not be able to move in suburbia. If we do, there's going to be crime and all that stuff. The constant racism that's been put on a stain, continue to put a stain on Black people in this country. Where do you, find out without Obama for 8 years, and as the president, and we have Ben Carson now, who's been in there for almost 3 years. Where do you think we can begin rectifying some of the issues, or actually some of the healing when it comes, or even fixing the housing disparity that we have in this country?
We have to know that we have to exercise our collective power. So when Obama was elected, so many people were like, oh, this is so fabulous. They're like, go do it for us, right? And so we didn't back him up, even in terms of pressing him into certain agendas. And then he had a staunch, after the 2010 election, then staunch resistance for the rest of his 6 years. So we failed Obama. He was there, but he couldn't do everything by himself, and we needed to continue to be organized and in the streets if necessary, and providing that backup. And I think in all of our work, there are going to be people inside like Dr. Gandhi, and people outside like many of us who are not in the health department. We always have to have an inside-outside strategy. The people on the inside, they may have the information, they may know when money is going to be available, they may know, how to get you into, decision-making tables and the like. But then they need you if their work is too progressive and they're about to be fired. People on the outside, they got the lived experience, they're already trying to solve their problems and got good strategies and stuff like that. But they might need access to that investment from the health department, or they might need that word or that ability to talk. So we need to recognize, first of all, that institutions are made up of people, and that people outside have knowledge and skill, and we need to join inside outside. So that goes not just for the people, like for President Obama. I didn't have much hope for Ben Carson. And so that, Anyway, that's enough said. But what I'm saying is that we have to recognize, no matter who's in office, we need to continue to use our power. We need to know our power to recognize that action is power, and especially that collective action is power. So we can't sit back and wait for somebody to do something for us. Yes, we may have gotten you into office. You need to be afraid of our disapproval, afraid of disappointing us. This is what Rashad Robinson, The Color of Change, says. You know, we don't have power if policymakers and those in power are not afraid of disappointing our communities. So we need to make people listen to us and be aware of us and recognize our power. So we need to mobilize and stay on it. We can't sit back.
All right, you want to start back?
I do.
Thank you.
Okay.
Questions?
Okay, so here, hold on. Let me just, so this is going to be kind of quicker because I'm trying to be aware of the time, and I do want to hear a few more questions. 4 years ago, when I was the president of the American Public Health Association, I launched our association and as many other communities and organizations and all as would join us on a national campaign against racism with 3 tasks: to name racism, to ask how is racism operating here, and then to organize and strategize to act. Naming racism is important, as I've said, because if you don't name racism, if you don't say the whole word in the context of widespread denial, you're complicit with that denial. And I've given you lots of tools and definitions and stuff to enable you to more confidently name racism and engage in these discussions with everybody. I want to, I guess before I go on, that was 2016. And you know, the impact of that was slow in coming, but Wisconsin, in Milwaukee County in Wisconsin, in May of 2019 was the first jurisdiction to make a declaration that racism is a public health crisis. And that came directly out of the Wisconsin Public Health Association having such a declaration, which came directly out of my campaign. So even though that was 3 years later, that was one thing. But now this shows 21 states. Now there are 25 states, because this was just October 1st. That was Thursday. There are more states that I've become aware of now. 25 states, half of our states have some city or county, or in 5 cases, the state as a whole, have declared racism to be a public health crisis. That's an important naming thing. They are saying, hold us accountable, public. We recognize that racism not only exists, but that it's affecting the public health. But the question is, what do we do next? And it's related to one of the questions I just answered. The health departments, I mean, these aren't even the health departments. These are the city councils. This is the county board of commissioners. These aren't even the county health departments or city health departments. But these jurisdictions now have to reach into community to find the people who are already working to solve the problems in the community, to invest in those people, to elevate their voices, to bring them to decision-making tables, to learn from those communities. That's the next step. And as we do that, then the question will be, how is racism operating here? That's a legitimate question, because as I've said, racism is not a cloud or a miasma we can't get a handle on. It is a system with identifiable and addressable mechanisms, which are in our structures, policies, practices, norms, and values, which are each elements of decision-making, where structures are the who, what, when, and where of decision-making, especially who's at the table and who's not, and what's on the agenda and what's not. And if structures are the who, what, when, and where of decision-making, policies are the written how of decision-making, practices and norms are the unwritten how of decision-making, and values are the why. And I recommend that people take this question with them everywhere to help identify levers for intervention, targets for action. How is racism operating here in my neighborhood, at my workplace, in my child's school? How is racism operating here with regard to police killings of unarmed Black and brown men and women, where structures include the absence of civilian review boards in most part of this country, civilian review boards that can monitor practice. Policies include reliance on grand juries to indict police officers. It's not enough that a police officer shot a gun and the person is dead. They can't be charged with murder unless it goes through a grand jury in most parts of this country. Or the Law Enforcement Officers' Bill of Rights. Practices include the over-policing of communities of color, which results in more accidental interaction, and no-knock warrants that resulted in the death of Breonna Taylor and so many others, chokeholds that resulted in the death of Eric Garner and so many others, and choke knee, in the death of Mr. George Floyd. The norms include the blue code of silence. You know, when a police officer sees another officer doing something wrong, they just didn't see anything. And now I'm heartened that at least a few police departments have mandated that if you as an officer see another officer doing something wrong, you need to say something. And if you're there in the moment, you also have to intervene. And finally, values, the values that view Black men as inherently threatening. So if you're a police officer and you kill somebody and you say, but I was afraid of them, and you get a pass, oh yeah, they were a Black man, I understand, right? What? Or the dehumanization of people of color. So all of these, you know, this is just like a few. We could, at each of these levels, identify targets, and then once we identify the targets, then a group can say, okay, well, we're going to try to establish a civilian review board here, or we're going to try to address the blue code of silence, or whatever, so that doing this thought experiment helps. What about with regard to excess deaths of Black, brown, and indigenous people from COVID-19, where the issue is, first of all, that we're more likely to become infected because we're more exposed and less protected. And then once infected, we're more likely to die because we're more burdened by chronic diseases with less access to healthcare. Well, how is racism operating here? And I can't dwell on all of these. The racial segregation with disinvestment of housing, which also results in educational segregation because of how we fund public schools based on local property taxes, which often turns into poor educational outcomes, and the fact that we are overrepresented in the essential jobs that are low paid, you know, kind of frontline work because we didn't get the education to even do more. Which is resulting not only in the fact that we're more exposed, but also that we carry in our bodies the burden of this disinvestment of communities with the crowded housing, the lack of green space, and lack of fresh fruits and vegetables, and the poisoned air and the like. Disproportionate incarceration, so we're more likely to be in the prisons and in the jails and the detention centers, we're more likely to be unhoused, and on and on. In terms of policies, the limited personal protective equipment for low-wage essential workers, and that backs up not only that the workplace is not providing this to the bus drivers or to the grocery clerks or, you know, to the home health aides that are caring for so many people, but it backs up into the fact that the President of the United States has not invoked the Defense Production Act to increase the production of masks and other personal protective equipment, to increase the production of tests. And then, as Dr. Gandhi said, limited paid sick leave, limited, you know, family and medical leave, lack of hazard pay, and the like. Practices include a lot of our testing practices, the location of our testing centers, and the fact that we have still been focusing testing on people who are symptomatic, or now if you have an exposure, a known exposure. That's a wrong testing strategy, but I could talk for 10 minutes on that, so I'm not going to. The denial of racism, which, as I say, is the staunch positioning of many people in this country, which is fostered by our narrow focus on the individual that makes systems and structures either invisible or irrelevant. The fact that we're ahistorical and act as if the present were disconnected from the past. The myth of meritocracy, if you work hard, you'll make it. All of that also plays into like people blaming people of color for being more infected and dying more from COVID-19. Well, they just didn't take it seriously or whatever, without understanding that COVID-19 ripped the sheets off of structural racism in this country, revealed it prominently. And you will notice that we have already started to normalize the disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on communities of color. That's not the lead story anymore. Just the way we normalized the disproportionate impact of HIV/AIDS on communities of color, or infant mortality and the like. Unacceptable. And then the values which are being written into our crisis standards of care. These are the guidelines. If a hospital has 1 ventilator left and 10 people who need it, who's going to get that ventilator? Where the work role is often being written into these crisis standards of care, age, and the existence of pre-existing chronic diseases. So if you have diabetes and that's going to make you ineligible for that ventilator or much lower on the priority list, they are writing racism into who is able to access this life-saving care right now. So I told you in answer to one of the questions that I've been thinking about 7 what I was describing as social or cultural barriers to achieving health equity, which I am now framing as values targets for anti-racism action. So here they are. I've mentioned 4 of them already. The first in this country, we are so narrowly focused on the individual that it makes systems and structures either invisible or seemingly irrelevant. It also means that our self-interest is very narrowly defined. We don't even count our aunts and uncles and cousins as part of our group, much less the people across town. We have a limited sense of there, but for the grace of God go I. We're all in this together. I'm my brothers and my sisters' keepers. And a limited sense of collective efficacy. We ask, what can I do? It's such a big system. What can I do? As opposed to what can we do? The second of these 7 values targets is the fact that we in this nation are ahistorical. We act as if the present were disconnected from the past, and as if the current distribution of advantage and disadvantage were just a happenstance. And when you are ahistorical, you're born, things are a certain way, you assume they've always been that way and they will always be this way, and it even gives you a very limited sense of how we can intervene and change systems and structures. The third, this myth of meritocracy. If you work hard, you'll make it. I already told you, yes, most people who have made it have worked hard, but there are many other people who are working just as hard or harder who will never make it because of this uneven playing field that is structured and perpetuated by racism, sexism, and these other systems of structured inequity. When you deny racism, then you are endorsing the myth of meritocracy and blaming people who didn't make it for being lazy or stupid. And there are many ways to deny racism. One way is to say, I don't think racism exists. And we've heard some people say that recently. But another way to deny racism is to never say the full word racism. You could be talking all day long about disproportionalities and disparities and diversity and equity, inclusion and cultural competence and structural competence and implicit bias, or, as well as explicit bias, and unconscious as well as conscious bias, or even race. You could talk all day long for weeks and months and years on that. If you never say the word racism, the ism piece, of course, is the structure piece, the system piece. If you never say the word racism in our context of widespread denial, you are complicit with that denial. The fourth of these values targets is our endorsement of the myth of a zero-sum game, that if you gain, I lose, which sets us up in competition with one another as opposed to cooperation. It masks the cost of inequity, that racism and all these other systems are sapping the strength of the whole society through the waste of human resources, and it hinders efforts to grow the pie. It's almost like I'm sitting at a potluck dinner and I don't want you to come over and eat because I think you're going to eat all the food up. I don't even recognize you're bringing cakes and pies and roast and salads and fruits and all kinds of good stuff with you because I don't even value you. The fifth of these 7 is limited future orientation. Now, the parts of the future that we can touch today are the children and the planet. In this country, we have a strong disregard for the children and a usurious relationship with the planet. In this country, we do not share the 7 generations perspective when we do decision making that many American Indian nations do, where they think, what is the impact of this policy or this decision 7 generations hence? Nor do we have, I am told that Maasai people in East Africa, when they greet one another, they don't say, hey, how you doing? They ask the question, how are the children? And they hope to hear back, all the children are well. In this country, we do not even ask, how are the children? And if we did, we certainly wouldn't hear the answer, all the children are well. The 6th of these 7 is the myth of American exceptionalism. The story that goes like this: the U.S. is so special, so different, so, anointed by God that we don't have to care what happens in the rest of the world. We can isolate ourselves, and that there's nothing we can learn from what anybody else is doing in the world. And I only wish that we would learn from all of the countries that are doing such a better job at containing and addressing this COVID-19 pandemic. There would be so many tens of thousands of lives saved. And the 7th of these values targets is actually the first, the foundational one, white supremacist ideology, which I told you is the false belief in a hierarchy of human valuation by race with white people. So first of all, there's no hierarchy of human valuation by race. And even if there were, who would put white people as at the top as the ideal or norm? But white supremacist ideology combines those 2 ideas, which gives people who are living as white a sense of entitlement. It results in the dehumanization of people of color and fear at the browning of America, which is animating and underlying our political divide in this country today. So what can we do today? Going back to that image of the restaurant, we need to actively look for evidence of 2-sided signs. Is there something differential going on here by race, by gender, by language, by immigration status, by zip code, by religion, by urban, rural, by anything? we have to look, not only is there something differential going on in terms of outcomes, but also is there something differential going on in terms of opportunity structures. We cannot feel satisfied that we look up and we say, oh, looks open to me. The second is that we need to burst through our bubbles of experience to experience our common humanity in different settings. Each of us lives in a bubble. Often we do not understand that just across town, there are people who are just as kind, funny, generous, hardworking, smart as we are, who are living in very different circumstances. We need to burst through our bubbles as individuals and as organizations and collectives, create opportunities to burst through bubbles so that we can experience our common humanity in different circumstances and so that we can build common cause. We need to be interested in the stories of others and then believe the stories of others and then join in the stories of others. We need to see the absence of who is not at the table, what is not on the agenda, what policies are not in place that if put in place could be quite productive. And we need to reveal inaction in the face of need, because that's how structural racism most often operates these days. But once, I was like, oh my God, I put all of the action steps inside the restaurant. Those of us on the outside also need to know our power. We need to recognize that action is power, and especially collective action is power. Why us? Why now? Because we have the power and it is important right now, and we have to be in it for the long haul. This is not a 5 to 10 year thing. We're going to be passing this baton to our children and them to their children. But as we continue working, we will continue to dismantle this system and put in its place a system in which all people can know and develop to their full potentials. Thank you for your invitation, for your listening and your questions. And I hope we have time for a few more questions.
Again, I'm just, like I said, I am so happy to see that everybody feels the same way that I've been feeling. Why I knew that we needed you here today, for this point in this time that we are in. Mike, do we have any other questions that came up so far in the chat box?
I have to scroll through all the incredibly positive comments. But I don't see anything except that apparently she's going to get at least 1,000 write-in votes for president. That's all.
Thank you all. Well, I don't want to, this has been lovely. And if there are some questions, either from the chat or a hand raised, maybe one or two, but if not, then I know that we're just at about the time we need to be, so I'm not trying to make things go over.
No problem. What I asked, if everybody could join me, and this is going to be totally crazy for just 20 seconds. I've asked Oren if he would unmute everyone so you could join me in just 10 seconds of applause for Dr. Jones. So in just a second, everyone is going to be unmuted. And we're going to just start cheering. All right, there we go. I can hear you all coming in.
Great job.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Very comprehensive.
Awesome.